So in this segment, we're going to be talking about Olaf Scholz kind of giving a statement out, or at least the new German direction, which is with Merkel gone, Germany gets tough on Brexit. So this is different. Merkel apparently a person who would, or Merkel would rather do things behind closed doors and deal with leaders, at a more diplomatic basis. Apparently Olaf Scholz does not adhere to that model. But I have kind of some theories about why he would be doing this, and I'll talk about that towards the end of the video. But some interesting statements from this Politico article, which is Johnson arrived in Bavaria for the G7 annual summit of world leaders hosted this year by the new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Beyond the handshake diplomacy, Johnson finds himself facing a centre-left leader who has decided to break ranks with the discreet style of his predecessor and deliver clear public rebukes to London over its Brexit manoeuvring. So clearly Germany have had enough, or appear to want to really be tough on the Tories or on England, Westminster, because of the trouble we're creating around the single market. The new Chancellor has chosen to adopt a more robust public stance than his predecessors' sometimes opaque utterings over Brexit. Shows you the diplomat kind of Merkel was. This has played out in speeches, public comments, and across the airwaves since Britain published the Northern Ireland Protocol earlier this month. The bill would grant British ministers the power to disapply parts of the protocol. That's something we've spoken about weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I don't know, I've lost track of time. In their public remarks following the bill's publication, Scholz and his hawkish foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, a Green Party member of the German coalition, made their displeasure crystal clear. It's a very regrettable decision that the British government has taken, Scholz said. It is a departure from all the agreements we have made, and I agree with Olaf Scholz there. It is a very regrettable decision that the British government is making here. All this to appease, their backbenchers, the ERG. London is unilaterally breaking the agreement, Baerbock said, and it is doing so for predictable motives on its own. We in the EU cannot accept that. The Tory party are doing this in order to protect themselves, really. The one thing the Conservative government cares about more than anything is the state of the party winning the next election. That's it. In private, Scholz is said to be highly critical of Johnson's handling of the issue and fears the protocol bill may lead to a trade war between the EU and Britain, which, if the UK actually uses the powers in the legislation, I think that would de facto lead to a trade war. It just depends on how quickly the EU want to do this and how damaging they want to be. German officials say there is a cross-party consensus in Germany on the need to protect the single market. Berlin has dialed up the rhetoric in recent weeks, almost rivaling that of Brexit-bashing French President Emmanuel Macron. The French love to bash the Brits and the Brits love to bash the French, but evidently Germany is getting in on the act as well and are being a lot louder about their opposition to us, which is fair enough. I think they're absolutely right to do this. It is not just Scholz is more direct than Merkel, who felt frustrated by Johnson on many occasions, but with some very rare exceptions chose to express her views privately, a German diplomat said. And I'm sure she would have her reasons to do that, and that's fine. Different leaders have different ways of announcing they're annoyed at something. Some people do it behind closed doors, some people don't. Berlin also judged this is the more appropriate time to send a blunter message that the UK must abandon any ambitions to rewrite the protocol, they said. Germany also wants to dispel the suggestion that the row is merely an issue between the UK and Ireland, because it's not. It's a row between the UK and all EU member states. Because at the end of the day, the UK is looking to blow a hole in the EU single market, and that's something that affects all of them. If subpar goods go from GB to Ireland, for example, those goods can go anywhere into the EU single market. And so, it's in every member of the EU single market to really, really look at what's going on here and really stand behind, the EU Commission and also behind Ireland as well. In Berlin, the German government has published a detailed explainer on its own website, explaining the importance of the protocol to German voters, which is great. Get the voters on side, educate them about what's going on. Miguel Berger, the new German ambassador to the UK, who has previously served as Secretary of State, has been given license to tour broadcast studios to make Germany's case direct to the British public, which again I think that's great. Going to radio stations, potentially going on TV and talking about the issues and really explaining things to the public. I think it's a good idea. The diplomat said, "I can tell you there is a lot of disappointment with this bill, especially because we thought with the whole Ukraine crisis, this was not the moment to have this debate," he told LBC. So essentially, especially with us dealing with the situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that Britain should not be piping up now. But I think the Tories see this as a good time to do so because the EU's attentions are divided by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and, of course, Poland and Hungary that are messing around. Adding that many European capitals feel there is a space to find a negotiated solution to the protocol route after the summer. And the fact is, not with Boris Johnson are they going to get anywhere, in my opinion. I don't know if any of the Tories, apart from maybe Tobias Ellwood or Tom Tugg on his hat, would they get anywhere with, because they're all trying to out-hawk each other at this point. Another German official warned the protocol was a prerequisite for the conclusion of the 2019 Brexit deal, which is true. We would not have got the trade and cooperation agreement were it not for the Northern Ireland Protocol. Berlin regards efforts to unilaterally suspend the Northern Ireland Protocol as a breach of the law and a breach of trust, which, again, that's true. In the event that the United Kingdom persists with this legislative project, the EU will consider all options, and suspending the TCA or parts of it will definitely be on the list of things to do. This explicitly includes measures under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It's one of the reasons one of the MEPs wanted to sign the Trade and Cooperation into EU law, because they wanted to use aspects of it to really punish the UK if the event that something like this happened. From words to action, resorting to such public threats is not so easy for Germany, where there is growing frustration at the post-Brexit deterioration of its bilateral relationship with the UK on almost everything bar defence cooperation against Russia. And I don't know historically, obviously, kind of post-World War II, what the relationship between the United Kingdom and Germany has been like. I don't think it's been that bad. German-UK trade has now fallen for 5 consecutive years. Obviously, that would be, kind of pre us leaving the EU fully. So post-referendum, but before us formally leaving the EU, Berlin is worried about growing industrial decoupling, companies in each country reducing their interdependency following Britain's EU departure, because at the day, countries that trade with each other typically, you would hope, get into less disputes with each other, less actual confrontations. Britain is on course to drop out of the list of Germany's top 10 trading partners for the first time since 1950. I mean, that's wild. It does show you kind of how damaging, Brexit kind of is. A senior EU official said the change in tone of Germany's warnings has not been translated into tougher stance inside the room where EU member countries discuss the bloc's response. So effectively, Germany's got tougher with words but not with actions. And when they get into the meetings together, the Germans aren't really pushing for anything super aggressive by the looks of things. But Malcolm Chalmers, the deputy director at the RUSI think tank and an expert in British security and foreign policy, said the dynamics between the UK and EU capitals have changed significantly as a result of Johnson's bill. He cautioned London should not bank too much on Germany's obvious interest in maintaining exports to Britain, and there are a lot of EU countries that would obviously want to keep the UK as an export market. It's very clear. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement, I think, in my opinion, is a sign of that. But at the end of the day, just because they are willing to trade with us doesn't mean that they will always be willing to, regardless of our actions. He says there's a risk that the UK will underestimate the willingness of the EU to retaliate with economic measures to further restrict the UK's access to European markets, including potential tariffs. And, the UK does export a decent amount to the EU, but I think with the bloc kind of trading more internally and looking at other third countries, I think for the most part they should be fine. It will knock up their inflation a bit, but I don't think it will be super damaging. But if they block their exports to the UK, that could be problematic. But again, they would have to look to new export markets as well. Many in Berlin wonder how far Boris Johnson is planning to actually go with the bill, and say the answer will determine the intensity to the EU's retaliation, because it's one thing signing the bill into law, it's another thing actually using the powers in it, and that might be the EU's calculation of, well, the UK are signing this thing into law, but are they actually going to use it? It's one thing to have a gun, it's another thing to fire it. Thomas Hacker, a trade policy lawmaker from the Free Democratic Party, one of Scholz's 2 coalition partners, believes the prospect of economic turmoil means Johnson will ultimately be forced to back down. And I don't know if that's true, because I don't know how much damage EU sanctions do. I can imagine it would cause a lot of damage to the UK economy. But right now, as a state of play, our inflation is incredibly high. I think it's above 10%. Johnson's done very little to curb the cost of living crisis. He was, essentially they were forced into doing a windfall tax in the end by, Labour and the media and also members of the public. So just because the EU sanctions, unless things go really south, like you're talking maybe 15 percentage points of inflation, etc., I think Johnson would be willing to do this, because I don't think he cares in the end. All he cares about is power. If this, if the EU sanctions us and it makes his chance of winning the next election more difficult, that's the only calculation he's going to come out with. can I win the next election? Can I keep control of the Tory party? Johnson will look at the overall economic situation post-COVID with inflation, the economic impact of the Ukraine war, Hacker said. He goes, I don't think he can afford a trade war. In my view, the current moves are more domestically motivated. But, what better than to start a trade war with the EU and blame all of the problems on the EU, which the British government have done for a long time now. If we suddenly get into a trade war with the EU, all of that inflation, all of the extra pressures that we're facing, they're just going to blame them and say, look, we wanted to keep Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. The EU wanted to annex Northern Ireland to benefit Ireland or some nonsense that they'll come out with. And then they'll be like, we had to do this to protect our union, to protect, the United Kingdom, essentially. And they'll make the EU out to be the villains. Whether that works or not, I don't know. Whether people care about Northern Ireland that much, I don't know. But that's what could end up happening here. But I think the fact is, if the UK mess around, I think we'll result in a trade war. But the idea that Boris Johnson wouldn't do this because of the threat of a trade war, I don't think is true. The man's a maniac. In London, Germany's message has thus far been received with little more than a resigned shrug, so essentially they don't really care. We don't really care over here. The government official described the international response to the bill as mixed, but basically what you would expect. He said the government remains confident it's found the right approach to fix the long-standing issues of the protocol. I mean, that's a load of rubbish. We believe it is legal, it abides by international law. Then show us the legal advice you got. Show us the basis of the legality. Because you're going to have to show us when you go to court. So just show us now. Save me the trouble of doing a video in a few months' time and, just kind of wrap up the video. I think one of the reasons why maybe, and I could be wrong on this, I'm sure I'll get pelters in the comments, but, feel free to do so, which is I think one of the reasons why the new Chancellor Olaf Scholz might be going more aggressive on the UK, because I think he might want to distract from the failings of Germany's kind of inability to fully sanction and fully wean itself off from Russian fossil fuels. So in order to kind of distract from that, they're using, kind of Britain as something to attack and distract the German people with. I don't think the German people will fall for stuff like that, especially as their cost of living crisis goes up, and especially because they'll be aware of how, I think some people in Germany, maybe most people, will be aware of how reliant they are on Russian fossil fuels and the way that's kind of, the continuation of trade is really helping Russia still fund the war against Ukraine. But that's just my opinion. I could be wrong on that one. If anyone wants to debate me on that one, I'll be happy to do so. But I'm going to wrap it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.